Welcome back. We're discussing issues that the authors felt were important in chapter 4. This is actually the fourth segment of chapter 4. And we're going to talk for a few minutes about at least the first government intervention, and that's going to be a price floor. And for those of you that may not have been involved or understood or been exposed to price floors in the past, it's something that most individuals, if they've ever been employed, especially fast food, some type of institution that kind of an introductory level job, a price floor is something that, again, we've all been involved with at one time or another, because the minimum wage is a price floor. Basically, the minimum wage, and I'm not even sure what it is now, but let's say it's $10. If the minimum wage is $10, then that is the least amount, or it's the minimum allowable price that companies, entities, institutions are allowed to pay for labor. We all know that even though it's against the law theoretically against the law to hire below that minimum allowable price, or the price floor, or in this case, the minimum wage, it happens all the time. We see it in the agricultural community. You see it here in Atlanta with landscapers, with individuals that take care of swimming pools, that do pruning and tree work, and you see it all across the United States. And that's what happens, unfortunately, a lot of times in a issue where there's government intervention. It almost sets up a black market for these goods and services. So if the wage rate is, like said, at $10, you're going to have individuals out there that are going to hire people below that $10 rate to do or to help them as they produce goods and services. And it's going to be more profitable for the individual doing the hiring or the company owner, as long as they don't get caught. But again, and again, we see it continually, whether it's a price floor, whether it's, we're going to talk about some rental rates and some ceilings on it. You see it I was going through the line at the grocery store the other day, and an individual, I don't know whether it was a SNAP program or some type of food subsidy program, that individual pulled out this EBT card, this electronic benefit transfer card that they're using now for these government subsidies. And she pulled it out, swiped it at the grocery store, didn't know anything, walked out the door. Cashier didn't check her ID. Cashier didn't even bother to look at whether she was, the individual was donor of the card or not. The individual just swiped the card, paid for the grocery, and walked out. We've seen it historically, time after time, when food stamps were being used instead of these EBTs. You saw it, people would take their book of food stamps, sell them sometimes, 25, 50 cents on the dollar, take the money, turn around and go in and buy other goods and services, because they knew, especially alcohol, cigarettes, they couldn't use their food stamps to buy those services. So anytime there's government intervention, even though the government thinks they know better what's good for you than you do, or they're trying to improve the social benefit and social welfare of a population or a subpopulation, there's always going to be the opportunity for those entrepreneurial individuals to figure out a way to circumvent that market, to figure out a way how to create a black market for those goods and services. We saw it in, with the checks that were supposedly going out the door, and the rampant fraud during COVID. So it's always going to be there. Potential is always going to be there when there's government intervention. But again, we're talking about, in this piece of government intervention, we're going to talk about price floors. And basically a price floor, it's going to raise the prices that buyers and sellers see above the equilibrium price. And if you think about it, and we'll just talk about the wage rate. If the wage rate is set at $10, if that's the price floor for the minimum wage, and if the equilibrium price is $8, it's going to help raise, it's going to pay those individuals working above the equilibrium price. If the equilibrium price is $12 and then the floor is set at $10, it doesn't matter. That at that point, because the floor, this price floor has to be set above the equilibrium price for it to work. So if it's above the equilibrium price, it works well. If it's below the equilibrium price, it's not going to help anybody because the free market is driving that $12 rate as opposed to the $10 minimum wage. And what typically can happen when you set that lower price limit, or when you set the limit, it generally creates a surplus. So remember, equilibrium price and quantities where supply and demand curves intersect. If it's set above that equilibrium price, it's going to generate a surplus. If companies feel like that $8 the maximum that they can pay for labor and the minimum wage rate set at $10, they just will not hire. And if you're going to have more people in the market at that $10 price, then you have companies willing to pay that $10 price, so it ends up with a surplus. And if the market price rises above that floor, then it's irrelevant at that point. Want to talk about, we talked about just the minimum wage and how that impacts it, but it's the same thing when we're talking about, and they talk about price floors creating surplus with government commodities. You typically think about price floors and subsidies for agricultural commodities. Think about corn, soybeans, oats, wheat, some other cereal grains. You think about the price of a gallon of milk that can get some subsidies. So dairy farmers are getting subsidies. Used to be subsidies and price controls on tobacco, either price controls on the number of pounds of tobacco you could raise or the number of acres of tobacco you could have. But again, you're talking about trying to generate price floors because from a farmer's perspective, income is extremely volatile. Revenue and income is extremely volatile, and it shifts from year to year. And the volatility in that revenue and income is driven by typically disease, especially disease in plants and animals, storms. Think about tornadoes, hail. Think about when a hurricane comes through the Florida coast and destroys the citrus crops. There are a lot of things that impact the initial supply, and that's going to drive. It's not only going to drive and play with prices, but it's going to drive and play with quantity supplied. So basically what the government does on a price floor, when it sets a price floor, it's trying to, I don't want to say guarantee, but to some extent guarantee revenue to a farmer for a particular crop. And basically what happens on this, on the price floor is that floor is set, and the government decides that if they set the price floor on a bushel of corn, at least years ago, if they set it at $5 a bushel and equilibrium price, they had to sell it for $4 a bushel, then the government would, if that was the equilibrium price, government would buy everything at $5 rather than farmers getting it $4. And then what the government would do with this surplus, and they would pass it on either at a discounted rate to some underdeveloped countries. There were free lunch programs in schools. If you were eligible for a subsidy or food subsidy through one of your subsidized programs, at least the United States Department of Agriculture would buy these goods and services. especially milk products, and they could store it. They could store the milk products either as powdered milk, they could store it as butter, they could store it as cheese. Peanut butter was a huge commodity that USDA bought. Honey was also a commodity. And if you were eligible for these subsidized programs, trucks from the United States Department of Agriculture would come around on a monthly basis. And if you were eligible, you came to where the distribution center was, especially in a lot of small and rural areas. Usually it was the fire station or the fire department. You came to that distribution station with your documentation that said you were eligible for that subsidy, and they would pass out these subsidies, and that helped supplement the food programs that USDA had. So USDA were getting rid of it at that way for that particular time. It just kind of evolved over the years. They've gone to some programs are guaranteed rather than the government buying the subsidies and buying the surpluses and having to store them. They are, paying target prices directly to farmers. There's also some insurance programs that help guarantee these target prices. And that mostly came in, I think after 1973 is when they started moving away from buying the surplus and moving more toward target prices. What typically happens on a price floor is, the supply moves to the right, the demand moves to the right, quantity goes up. It's a question mark on the price. So what's going to happen on these price floors is, what do you see in the grocery store? And typically in the grocery store, it kind of raises the price of the food products you see. And then in return, you as a taxpayer are turning around and having to pay through your federal income taxes, you're having to pay to support these price floors. So I don't know, it's a little inefficient. It's somewhat of an inefficient way to help subsidize the American farmer, but it's also in subsidizing the American farmer, you're guaranteed foods and commodities that are necessities for life here in the United States. I guess the drawback to it, it's somewhat disproportionate to, at least the authors think it's disproportionate to the larger farmers. So larger farmers may get a disproportionate share of these guaranteed prices or the impacts, the positive impacts of the price floor. And if you're a smaller farmer, you may miss out. So there's, again, inefficiencies, sets up some black market issues, especially when the USDA passed out the food products, the subsidized food products. As I mentioned before, what would happen is individuals would go, they would pick up their butter, their cheese, their powdered milk, honey, peanut butter, whatever the USDA was passing out at that particular point in time, and then they turn around and sell it to somebody else, pocket the money, and everybody was happy at that point. So it did set up that black market. And again, with government intervention, there's always the opportunity for black market. But just remember, on a price floor, what's happening is the federal government is trying to decrease or mitigate the variation in revenue and incomes that are received from farm products. Setting that price floor, it actually raises the prices that you're paying in the grocery store, and at the same time, you're turning around and having to pay to support these programs through taxes. So, may not be the most efficient way to implement this intervention, but at the same time, it's helping to mitigate that income and that revenue level that farmers receive. I think that's all that we're going to talk about with the price floor, but we'll be back in a few minutes to talk about rental price ceilings, which it may be something that's unfamiliar to you, especially if you live in Tennessee. I don't think there's a rental price ceiling impact in the state of Tennessee. I know there's not in the state of Georgia, but there are several cities around the United States that have taken this approach. So We'll be back in a few minutes to talk about segment 5, and we're going to talk about rental price ceilings. Talk to you then.